53 years before Christ, 10,000 Roman soldiers marched into captivity and vanished, not killed in battle, not buried with honors. Gone, just gone, completely gone. No Latin map had ever charted where they ended up. Historians assumed they died in captivity, forgotten footnotes in a brutal empire story. Rome eventually recovered its military standards through diplomacy, but the men themselves, never accounted for. What happened to them remains one of the ancient world's greatest unsolved mysteries. But then archaeologists started digging in a tiny village in northwestern China, and what they found should not have been there. This is the story of the Roman legion that vanished into the east, and the mystery 2,000 years cannot solve. The year is 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus rides east, one of the wealthiest men in all of Rome. One-third of the Great Alliance historians call the First Triumvirate. He commands roughly 40,000 men, and he is absolutely desperate for glory because his partners, Julius Caesar and Pompey, already have it. He wants what they have, so he rides east to find it. What he finds instead is catastrophe. At a place called Carrhae, in what is now southeastern Turkey, the Roman legions meet Parthian general Shurna and his horse archers, and here is where it gets interesting. The Parthians do something Roman commanders have never planned for. They simply refuse to fight like Romans expect. No locked infantry lines, no pitched battle, just wave after wave of mounted archers, sweeping across the landscape, unleashing a continuous storm of arrows from horseback, retreating before Romans can close the distance, then sweeping back again. The legions tighten into their famous testudo formation, shields locked overhead like a great iron shell. But the Parthian arrows punch straight through bronze and wood alike, because of course they do. By the end of that single day, 20,000 Romans lie dead. On the plains outside Carrhae, 20,000 men. Crassus himself is killed, his head reportedly filled with molten gold, a ghastly tribute to his famous greed. Now, that detail is almost certainly apocryphal, the kind of story that attaches itself to powerful men's deaths, but it has endured 2,000 years, because it captures something true about how history wanted to remember him. This is one of the worst military defeats in the entire history of the Roman Republic. But 10,000 survivors are taken prisoner. And this is where the story truly begins. The 10,000 survivors of Carrhae do not go home. They are marched deep into the Parthian Empire, to a garrison city called Merv. In what is now modern Turkmenistan, the Parthians are practical people. These are trained soldiers, disciplined fighters, men who know how to build fortifications and hold defensive positions. So the Parthians put them to work for years, perhaps decades. These men exist in a strange suspended state, not slaves in the traditional sense, not free men, soldiers without a war, without a home, without a return. Rome makes several attempts to negotiate. Augustus, decades later, did succeed in recovering Roman military standards and some prisoners from Parthia in 20 BC. A diplomatic triumph he celebrated extensively, but the Carrhae survivors specifically, the 10,000 who disappeared into the Parthian interior, were never fully accounted for. Some may have been returned. What happened to the rest is the question history cannot answer. Then, around 36 BC, something remarkable happens. A Chinese military force under Han General Chen Tang pushes deep into Central Asia, fighting westward against a confederation of nomadic peoples. Near the Talas River, in what is now Kazakhstan, the Chinese records document something extraordinary, something the Han soldiers had apparently never encountered before. The enemy, fighters serving under a ruler the Chinese call Zhizhai, are using a combat formation described in specific detail. A wall of soldiers, shields locked together, overlapping, moving in coordinated defensive unison. The Chinese chronicle calls it a fish-scale formation. Oxford historian Homer Dubbs, who first formally proposed the connection in 1957, argued that Roman military historians would recognize this immediately as a version of the testudo, the Roman tortoise. Now, that identification is Dubbs's interpretation, not settled consensus among scholars. Critics have pointed out that interlocking shield formations were not exclusively Roman, but the description in the Chinese source is specific enough that the comparison has never been entirely put aside. And then the Chinese records note something else. After the battle, approximately 145 surviving foreign soldiers of unusual appearance are captured and resettled. taken to a location on the far western edge of Han Chinese territory, a place recorded on Chinese maps as Liqian. The ancient Chinese transliteration, some scholars argue, of the word legion. Just let that sit for a moment. The village of Liqian sits in Yongcheng County, Gansu Province, northwestern China. Today it is a quiet agricultural community, but it has been quietly extraordinary for a very long time. And what caught researchers' attention was not just the name, it was the people. For generations, locals in this region have told stories about ancestors who looked different, taller than surrounding populations, with lighter hair, with green or blue eyes appearing in families with no known outside contact for centuries. The villagers themselves carried oral traditions of descent from soldiers from the far west, from a great empire beyond the desert and the mountains. Homer Dubs was the first Western academic to formally propose the Liqian theory, publishing his paper in 1957, after years cross-referencing Chinese military chronicles with Roman historical sources. He identified the linguistic connection between Liqian and legion, traced the timeline of the captured Carrhae soldiers through Parthian records, and proposed the fish-scale formation comparison that would become central to the entire debate. His paper caused an immediate sensation, and an equally immediate backlash. Too extraordinary, too cinematic. Critics called it wishful thinking dressed up as scholarship. But then came the archaeology, and the archaeology was harder to dismiss. Archaeological surveys of the Liqian region revealed foundations built on a grid layout. Dubs and his supporters pointed to this as consistent with Roman settlement planning. Skeptics correctly noted that grid-based urban planning was also standard Han Chinese practice, so the grid alone proves nothing. But wooden watchtowers oriented in patterns, some researchers consider consistent with Roman frontier fort design, were also documented. Suggestive, not conclusive. The distinction matters, and the distinction is real. In 2005, a team of Chinese and Italian researchers conducted genetic testing on residents of the Liqian area, focusing specifically on villagers who showed those distinctive physical characteristics. The results were striking, and it is important to be honest about why they remain deeply contested. The sample size was very small. The scientific community noted this immediately. Approximately 60% of the villagers tested showed genetic markers with elevated European ancestry compared to surrounding populations. Some markers tracing toward Mediterranean and Near Eastern regions, but with a sample this limited. The statistical reliability of those patterns is genuinely questionable. Genetics researchers also rightly pointed out that the Silk Road created enormous population mixing across Central Asia for centuries. European genetic markers could have arrived through dozens of different migration pathways, completely unrelated to Roman soldiers. The study was not designed to distinguish between those possibilities, and it cannot. But the clustering of those markers, specifically in Liqian, rather than surrounding communities, has kept the question alive. Chinese archaeologist Zhao Kelly, who led excavations in the region from the 1990s, recovered skeletal remains from a cemetery near the village. Bone structure measurements falling outside the expected range for Han populations of the period. He stopped short of declaring the Liqian theory proven, but he said the evidence could not simply be explained away. That is a meaningful statement. It is not confirmation. The distinction still matters. A full systematic DNA study using modern genomic sequencing with proper archaeological context and a large enough sample to produce statistically meaningful results has never been completed. The question, 2,000 years after Carrhae, remains technically open, and that openness is not a failure of research. It is the honest state of the evidence. Now think about what this story is actually asking you to consider. 10,000 men marched into captivity in 53 BC. A remnant of them, if the theory is correct, eventually found their way east, across the entire width of the known ancient world, through Parthia, through Central Asia. Across the outer edge of every map any Roman cartographer had ever drawn, they may have fought in a battle the Chinese recorded. They may have been settled in a village the Chinese named after them. They may have built homes and watchtowers they recognized. They had children, and those children had children. And 2,000 years later, people in a farming village in northwestern China were still wondering why some of their grandparents had blue eyes. That chain of maybes is not a reason to dismiss the story. It is precisely what makes the story worth taking seriously, because the ancient world was more connected than we instinctively imagine. The Silk Road was not just a route for silk and spices, it was a corridor of human movement, of armies and refugees and wanderers and survivors. The Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, the two greatest powers of their entire age, never made direct diplomatic contact as far as we know, but perhaps, in the most unlikely way imaginable, through defeat and captivity and survival and sheer stubborn human endurance, they touched. We simply do not know. And that uncertainty, held honestly, is more compelling than a false answer in either direction. So, is the story of Liqian settled history? No, absolutely not. It is a question still waiting for the technology and the will to answer it properly. The Chinese military chronicles describe something. The name on the ancient map means something. The physical traits in that specific community have persisted long enough to attract serious researchers. The genetic study raised a possibility it could not confirm. All of it together amounts to a hypothesis that is genuinely fascinating and genuinely unproven. What historians can say with confidence is this: 10,000 Roman soldiers disappeared into the east after Carrhae. Rome never fully accounted for them. Somewhere between that battlefield, in what is now Turkey, and the quiet fields of Gansu province, their story continued, in ways the historical record does not clearly capture. Whether it continued all the way to Liqian is the question 2,000 years have not answered. Rome's forgotten soldiers may have found their final home not in Italy, not anywhere a Roman general would have planned. They may have found it at the far edge of the world, in the shadow of mountains their maps did not name, in a village that remembered them long after the empire that made them had crumbled into dust, or they may have died in Parthian service, their bloodline ending far short of China, and the similarities at Liqian explained by centuries of Silk Road population mixing. We do not know. That is the honest answer. And in a story this old and this strange, the honest answer is the most extraordinary thing of all. If this story made you think about history differently, subscribe to Insane History right now, because we find the stories that fall through the cracks of every textbook ever written, and leave a comment below. Do you think the Roman legion made it to China? Tell us where you think the evidence points, because this community asks the questions that matter.